Welcome to In God We Trusted, presented by Sunlit Studios. I'm your host, Will. I'm here alongside Sam. Sam, what are we talking about today?
Today we're going to be talking about religious liberty and censorship and kind of all things First Amendment and how important that is. And coming into this election, what's the record of the two candidates that we can look at to say which one of these is going to be better for us in preserving religious liberty?
And this should be a huge deal, this election. Like, we should really care as voters to see this especially and say, okay, who do we want to run this?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the Christian's power comes in the gospel, right? It's the spoken word. It's the ability to hold convictions, to believe that our ethics and values come from another world. And so to be able to defend those, to proclaim those, to not be shoved around by government intrusions, that's really important. Like, if we care about the gospel, this issue should be among the very top issues that we're concerned about.
And especially as Americans, because our founders cared a lot about this section.
Yeah, I mean, you go back to the people who came over here from Europe. They were coming over here fleeing from religious persecution. And after generations, when our founders got together and put together our founding documents, they came with these biblical understanding of who man is, that he's fallen, that he's depraved, that I'm selfish, you're selfish, nobody can be trusted with power. And so they framed a government that limited the powers of those that are in government, right? There's restrictions. The entire Bill of Rights is what the government may not do. There's separation of powers, there's checks and balances, there's term limits, there's all these things that were intended to restrict the power of government, but to empower the people. But government's natural tendency is always, it's never like, oh, here's your power back, here's everything back to you. Governments gobble up power, they gobble up authority. And so the Constitution was meant to be like you may not do that. It was a protection for the people. And the paramount amendment in the Bill of Rights was the First Amendment, which comes and says, the government cannot come to you and compel speech or censor your speech. The government can't come to you and intrude on your religious liberties or your religious practices. The government can't come to the press and tell them what to say. All of that is a cousin to religious liberty, because the moment the populace, the moment the citizenry is unable to then say, hey, government, you're going beyond your bounds or you're untrustworthy, if we're not allowed to speak up, if we're not allowed to practice our religion, then the government is unrestrained and can just trample over everything.
And that liberty extended to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, if you went back to the founding generation, the population was overwhelmingly Christian. I mean, it was, so that part was understood, but even the Jews that had come over were celebrated. Like, I love this out of history. In 1790, President Washington wrote a letter to congratulate Jewish citizens on founding a synagogue in Rhode Island. And he said, may the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in the land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants. He didn't say, hey, you're here, you must be this, he didn't intrude. Or John Adams wrote this gushing letter where he says, the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. They are the most glorious nation that has ever inhabited the earth. The Romans and their empire were but a bauble in comparison to the Jews.
High praise.
Yeah, high praise. And so that's the first and second president. So they wanted to set this example that religions were tolerated, that we wanted religion here. The founders were effusive with praise for religion, and they believed that liberty depended on morality and religion working together in the nation.
And as always, we want to ground these videos in Scripture. So where should we start looking in Scripture for these things?
Yeah, it's interesting because the Bible doesn't come to us and say, you have the freedom of this or that or the other. I mean, that was back under, like in Jesus' time, they were under a foreign oppression. But the Bible does come to us and talk to us about the importance of our words and our conduct and how we behave. And it doesn't say that you only do these things if the government allows for it or if they give you the liberty for it. Our founders viewed all of our rights as coming from heaven. In other words, they come from God. The Declaration of Independence says that, right? That we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, that liberty is a right that comes from God. And so the founder said, if government comes and tries to restrict those rights, you have a duty to rebel against them because those rights don't come from man, they come from God. And as we've said before in one of our previous episodes, what's the highest authority of our country? Is it the president?
No.
It's the Constitution. So our allegiance is to protect, defend the Constitution, which comes to us and tells us we have a right to the freedom of speech, right? And so that's a big deal in Christianity because, the Bible says in Proverbs 31:8-9, open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all those who are destitute. Well, who do you think you're opening your mouth to? You're going to the authority. Like, I need to advocate on your behalf. You're going to people who really don't want to hear this message, and yet it's calling you. Speak up for those that are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy to your government. Proverbs 18, verse 21 says, death and life are in the power of the tongue. You should never be willing to say, okay, I'll be quiet. I'll listen to you, government, and I'll forfeit my right to speak. The whole basis of the Great Commission, when Jesus says, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. Well, how do you do that? You don't do that with like hand emotions. You're not playing charades. You speak, you go. And by the way, when you go into territories that are going to persecute you for doing that, does it mean don't do it? There's no exception here. You speak justice, you speak gospel, and no matter where you go, even if the country is opposed to that, as a Christian, you have an obligation to do that. So our founders were super sympathetic to that, recognizing that speech is incredibly important. And so they said, okay, we don't want a foreign government, a foreign king to tell us what we can and can't say. So therefore, we want to make sure that that right is enshrined in our Constitution. And the model that's given to us in Scripture is when the government comes and says, you may not, you have an obligation to defy them. And that's biblical.
And we see that play out in the apostles' life.
Absolutely.
Pretty quickly.
Absolutely. So not long after the resurrection of Jesus, he ascends into heaven. The apostles, the early church is going. Peter and John are out preaching in the streets of Jerusalem because now they believe in the resurrection and they know this might cost them their lives. But they're still bold to preach. And so listen to Acts 5, verse 27, when the authority figures of Jerusalem come to them and say, hey, you better stop that. Listen to how this goes. And when they had brought them, they set them before the council. This is Peter and John. And the high priest questioned them, saying, we strictly charged you not to teach in this man's name, yet here you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us. And Peter and the apostles says, oh, you're so right, we'll stop. No, that's not what happens. Peter and the apostles said, we must obey God rather than men. Part of the ninth commandment, the ethic of the ninth commandment is to be truthful, right? It says not to bear false witness against your neighbors, but buried in that is you're a person who stands against falsehoods. If I'm hearing destructive falsehoods that are going to devastate or bring destruction on other people, and I'm silent when that's happening, guess what? I'm part of it. I'm part of the problem. I'm part of the falsehood. That makes me untruthful. And we serve a God, Jesus, who says what? I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. The ethic of the Christian is to come to bring speech to bear on culture, to advance justice, mercy, all the things that are true, and to be people who defend the truth, no matter what. And when you have a government that comes and clamps down on that or says you may not speak, sorry, I'm going to speak, no matter what the consequences might be.
But we're hoping to have a government in place that does not impose consequences on our speech.
That's right. That's right. And that's why elections are really important. You want to elect people that are going to defend your right to speak, that are going to defend your right to religious liberty, that are going to defend the press to be able to say whatever they're going to say or whatever platform to say whatever they want to say in a free country. That's really important. That's what this episode's about.
So let's get to these candidates.
Yeah, so we'll start with President Trump. Like when you look at him and you go online and you Google, which, you know, you're using a platform that's going to be mentioned later on in this episode, but Google will come back and tell you, okay, here's the way that he violated religious liberties. And the example that you hear every time is what was called the ban on Muslims. I don't know if you've ever heard that.
Yeah.
So in 2017, you have a civil war that's going on in Syria. It's involving ISIS, if you remember them. Mm-hmm. Everything is super hot, and the Trump administration came out and they implemented a temporary 90-day ban on immigrants that came from 7 predominantly Muslim countries: Syria, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, right? And so when he did that, everybody, you know, they were hotbeds for terrorism. They had terrorism problems in there. There was civil unrest in the vast majority of them at the time. And so, but it kept refugees from coming in. So like, let's say there are innocent Muslims in those countries that are like, we hate it here. We want freedom. We want to apply to the U.S. There was a ban that lasted 90 days. Well, This was called, President Trump wants to ban Islam. He wants to ban Muslims. And so it even went all the way to the Supreme Court, where they ruled 5-4 that his actions were totally constitutional. And they said, of course, the president has a right to do that. Like if there's, if we have somebody who has expressed animosity toward us, which those nations had, we have a right to monitor who's coming into our country. And so they were okay with it. But the dissenting justices were like, this is Islamophobic. They pointed out comments that Trump had made that said things like, Islam hates us. And another one, we're having problems with Muslims coming into the country. Well, people took those comments and said he's looking to ban Islam everywhere. Now, what Trump doesn't do, or at least I couldn't find in my research, Trump doesn't come along, those policies impact people that are not citizens, and they prevent them from being able to come in. What I don't find is Trump saying, okay, here's our U.S. citizens. I'm going to implement a policy that takes away the rights of Muslims who are here. Like, you don't find that. But what you do find when people talk about his record in religious liberty and they say it's bad, you'll find two things. One, antagonistic rhetoric. Like, that is endangering Muslims. The Islamophobia is putting them at danger. And Trump does that. Like, he's a loose cannon when he talks. That's his thing. And a lot of times he's equal opportunity. So, like, listen to some of the things that he's done. So, rhetoric, right? He said that Jews who vote for Democrats are disloyal to Israel. Okay? Beyond his own comments about Islam, one official from the White House said Islam was a barbaric cult and later clarified that he meant radical Islam. Steve Bannon said that Islam is not a religion of peace. His national security advisor, Michael Flynn, said fear of Islam is rational. So the White House has people that say, okay, look to those Muslim countries. Look at the terrorism that happens there. This is not a peaceful religion. They're not safe to come here. And so what they would say is by using that kind of rhetoric, you're creating a culture of animosity toward people, and that's not healthy for religious liberty. Another one where the Pope came and criticized Donald Trump, I think he was in Mexico, and he said something like, anybody who only thinks of building walls cannot be a Christian, right? Okay. And Trump, of course,
responded,
lashed back out and said, for a religious leader to question a person's faith is disgraceful, and there was a little bit of a match between them. So right there, you've got him going up against a Catholic leader. You have him going up, against Jews that vote for Democrats. You have him going against Islam. So all this rhetoric, right? So that's one category, antagonistic rhetoric. But then the other side of what they say is he goes to the extremes of liberty. He allows, Christian, religious, or Muslim extremists to go and say that, this is what I believe, and therefore I'm not going to bake a cake for a gay couple that's getting married. Trump wants to protect that, and we're the party that's trying to squash discrimination. Trump wants to make it so that Christians don't have to perform abortions or give, abortifacient medications. Like, that harms people, and so we want to take those religious liberties away. And when you only cater to the religious extremists who hold those positions, you're harming religion in general. That's the argument.
Okay.
But what you don't find are like policy things that go to specific Christian, Muslim, Jewish groups and say, I'm taking away your right to exercise your faith in the way that you want to. You don't find that.
So in my book, that's a solid A.
I think so too. I'm a fan.
For all religions should be like, hey, let us do our thing. Let us preach what we want to preach and don't impede on that. That's the goal of America.
Mm-hmm. I 100% agree. Now, I do with some of the rhetoric. Some of it is like,
you would like him not to say some things?
Yeah, it's unnecessary and inflammatory sometimes. But when you get to the other side of the Biden-Harris administration or Kamala Harris's record prior to becoming vice president, there's a lot. There's a lot. And so for the rest of this episode, we're going to be talking about that. So where I'm coming to the table is, if this is one of the most important things, as a pastor, as somebody who preaches the gospel, who runs Bible shows and different things like that, when I see somebody who has a record that is habitually going after religious liberties, quelling speech and things like that, if I find that, I'm particularly alarmed by that. And we're going to go through a little bit of her record.
And that's a good part about this election is we're not dealing with two strangers.
That's correct.
We've seen them both in action. So this is not just us, doing hypotheticals. It's us saying, okay, this is what they've done while they held power. And it's likely to continue down that road no matter which way they go.
Yeah, and I'd like to address her record, but also kind of the climate that we're seeing develop in our country. and what we're seeing come out of administrations and cancel culture and censorship and all of those things, because all of those are a threat to liberty.
Okay, so let's start with Vice President Harris and where she stands on some of these things.
Okay, so let's go back to the days when she served as the California Attorney General. Like, she made it a practice to where she targeted her ideological opponents' ability to practice their own faith the way they saw fit. So one of the more famous examples is the case involving Hobby Lobby, the company that has Christian owners that are very pro-life, and they make themselves known to be pro-life. Well, she, in 2013, submitted an amicus brief to the United States Supreme Court to overturn a decision that allowed Hobby Lobby not to have to pay for health care insurance that covered abortions for their employees. In other words, coming to them and saying, you must pay for your employees to have health care to pay for an abortion. So imposing that on them. And the Supreme Court, thankfully, in a 5-4 decision, which is really close, that should be alarming that it's that close, decided on the side of religious liberty. Also, as California's Attorney General, she used her office to intimidate nonprofit organizations. So if you remember back in 2008, there was a big deal over Proposition 8 in California where they were voting on whether or not to define marriage as the union between a man and a woman, outlawing gay marriage essentially. And then the Mozilla CEO, so if you've ever used Firefox, that's old school. He was forced to step down because somebody leaked information saying that he had donated to that initiative. And so all these donors, it became weaponized against them. Like, you stand against us, well, you have to lose your job. In 2012, the Koch brothers, Charles and David, ran something called the Americans for Prosperity, which was a nonprofit organization, and it was libertarian. It sided on the conservative side. So Kamala Harris reinterpreted a California statute to demand that the organization disclose any donors that donated more than $5,000. Why would she want that?
To out all those people.
To out all those people. Why? Why would you imagine? It's not so that the government can do something that's functional or fruitful or helpful. It's so that all of those people would be embarrassed or exposed, and they would risk losing positions, social standing. And so that was troublesome, right? And so you'll remember not that long ago in the Obama administration, you had the IRS that had to apologize for targeting conservative organizations. You remember that?
Yeah.
Where people would apply for nonprofit status and the IRS would be like, they're conservative, slow it down, give them lots of scrutiny and everything else. And they eventually apologized to that. They did it to several hundred organizations. So if Kamala Harris is willing to do that to the Americans for Prosperity in California and to use her authority to out donors, taking control to where she would be chief over the IRS, which sees all of that stuff for every American. Imagine what you're entrusting her with. She hasn't earned that trust, in my opinion.
That's worrisome, to say the least.
As California Attorney General, she also referred to herself as the co-sponsor of something called the FACT Act. And what the FACT Act did is it goes to all these crisis pregnancy centers, which are pro-life, right? They're bringing women in, showing them other alternatives, giving them supplies, sometimes doing ultrasounds, trying to convince them to choose life. And she helped to get passed a law that made those people have to advertise and refer these women to abortion clinics.
That's crazy. Why would that ever be logical?
Unbelievable intrusion. So I believe that abortion is the greatest evil America has ever. It's a holocaust of more than 60 million people. To come and force me to advertise it when I'm actively engaged in a ministry trying to stop it is wicked, isn't it? Like, that's just kind of crazy. It would be like, imagine forcing Muslims to advertise for the neighboring synagogue, right? You would never do that. Or imagine forcing synagogues to promote the consumption of pork. Like, that would be super, super objectionable and offensive. But here she's advocating and supporting a law that's going to require people that believe abortion's a Holocaust to promote it. It's not good.
Did that go through?
That was eventually overruled by the Supreme Court, which is also a pattern for her. She gets behind things where the Supreme Court's like, no, that's unconstitutional. Stop trying to deviate from what the constitutional liberties are, which in and of itself should be a warning for us, right? Also, as Attorney General, she raided the home of a pro-life activist, David Daleiden. And he's the guy that, if you remember when the videos came forward where he did an undercover sting and caught Planned Parenthood officials talking about selling body parts and baby organs from aborted babies.
Yeah, that was big.
It went all over the place. It was all over the news. And ta-da, not right long after that, she orders California law enforcement to raid his home. He ends up getting charged with more than a dozen crimes, including faking his identity, attempting to purchase human organs. Like the whole thing was to expose that. They actually charged him with trying to buy human organs. It was just ridiculous. And so most of those charges got thrown out. But you see, like, there's the weaponization of justice in that. That was clear retaliation.
Okay, that was her as attorney general, but then we know she became a senator. So what's her record there?
Horrible. Like, I'm just going to say it. So as a senator, Kamala Harris authored and sponsored a bill that's called the Do No Harm Act. Sounds noble, right?
Sounds really nice.
Sounds great. But it would have severely restricted the right of religious organizations in hiring and in membership. So let's just go into the background. So they sought to basically gut a religious liberty law. It's mentioned in the bill, and that is called the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act of 1993. And so what this did, if you went back in time, the Supreme Court issued a ruling that said that states were allowed to prohibit Native Americans from using peyote, which is the hallucinogen, you know what that is? And they also allowed companies to go in and steal timber from sacred Native American grounds. And so the Supreme Court was siding with the government against them on their religious ideals. And so in 1993, all of Congress was like, whoa, this is a huge government overreach. We've got to go protect these religious minorities. And so they passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Well, Joe Biden even voted for this in 1993. But in the bill, listen to this carefully, because this even on first run through, it's like, oh, that sounds nice. I don't like discrimination. But listen to what it says. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993, so this is Kamala Harris's bill that she wrote, should not be interpreted to authorize an exemption from generally applicable law that imposes meaningful harm, including dignitary harm, on a third party. In other words, just because you're a Christian, you can't use your Christian beliefs to do something that may harm somebody meaningfully or cause dignitary harm. And you think, well, of course, Christians shouldn't want to harm anyone. But let me explain where she's going with this. If passed, they argued that Christian businesses and ministries would no longer have the religious liberty protections that keep the government from forcing them to cover the cost of abortions in their health care coverage, because that causes meaningful harm to women, right? And so by withholding abortion,
You harm someone.
you're harming them. So that's gone. And you can't say, but I'm a Christian, I believe in life. Gone, right?
Okay.
Then you ask yourself, what exactly is dignitary harm? Well, it's something that I say or do, and I say, well, I'm a Christian, I believe this, and it causes harm to your dignity.
That could be a lot of things.
That could be a lot of things. And so can a church decline a wedding ceremony for a gay couple? If they come and they say, we're looking to get married, and I say, I'm sorry, you can't get married in our church because we believe that's a sin. Does that impact your dignity? So that's gone. Can churches be targeted? Pastors be targeted? Can Christian schools decline transsexual students? Can you have membership? Like all of a sudden that's, oh, my dignity's impacted. Do I have to hire those teachers that are way out of line with what my school believes? So it would strip any ability for you to say, I'm a Christian, I'm different, I get to discriminate based on these things. Here's another part of the bill. So the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 should not be interpreted to authorize an exemption for one party that permits discrimination against others. So again, no discrimination as a Christian. But discrimination's not always bad, right?
Yeah.
So let me ask you this question. If you're looking for a babysitter, would you say that you discriminate against child molesters?
Yes.
I would hope so, right? Like discrimination in that case would be wise. And so as an employer, a Christian school should discriminate against atheists and Muslims. A Muslim school should discriminate against Christians and Jews and atheists. Like that's not the purpose. Religious liberty protects you to be able to bring in the teachers you want, to bring in the students you want, to guard your deeply held beliefs. But if religious liberty doesn't give an exception for anti-discrimination laws, then can Christian seminaries reject atheistic candidates? That would be discriminating. Gone. That liberty gone. Can a ministry fire someone for being engaged in an extramarital affair? Like in a normal business world, that doesn't happen. But so in Christian circles, can you say, no, we're a people who believe in marriage, we believe in fidelity, and therefore if you're not living in accordance with what we believe, we're going to let you go? Or is that discrimination? Because that guy, maybe he believes in polygamy. Like at what point? Because if you lose your religious exemption, then the church has no protections for the integrity of their institutions. And she's looking to gut that. She wrote that bill. An even more dangerous bill that she has gotten behind as a co-sponsor of is called the Equality Act, which is, they run this up the flagpole every Congress.
And again, well titled.
It sounds great. Like, oh, you're not for that? But Christian denominations have issued dire warnings about this. So I'll give you an example. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops warned that the Equality Act would, quote, run roughshod over religious liberty. The Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Liberties Commission, so this is the biggest denomination, Protestant denomination. What do they say about this? They say the Equality Act would punish faith-based charities for their core religious beliefs about human dignity and marriage and pose a significant threat to the deeply held religious beliefs of millions of Americans who honor God's design for sexuality. Okay, so the church isn't excited about this. I wonder why not.
Yeah, so what's in it?
So here we go. Actual text of the bill. This act makes explicit that existing federal statutes prohibiting sex discrimination in employment also prohibit sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. So your company, your church, your charity would no longer be able to prevent transsexuals or homosexual, gay, lesbian, all the alphabet from working at your place, right? You couldn't reject them as employees on that basis. Here's another part. An individual shall not be denied access to a shared facility, including a restroom, a locker room, and a dressing room that is in accordance with the individual's gender identity. So if Kamala Harris had her way and this bill was passed, our daughters would have no right to use a restroom, a locker room, a dressing room, free from the prying eyes of biological men. You good with that?
I'm not.
I'm very not. But this is saying your religious exceptions are gone. Another part of the bill gets back to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 and says that act shall not provide a defense or provide a basis for challenging the application or enforcement of a covered title, meaning your religious liberty no longer serves as a protection from what the government is going to impose on you. Radical departure from what this nation was founded to. I don't want the government imposing their beliefs on a Muslim community, a Muslim school, a Muslim mosque. I don't want them imposing it on any religious minorities unless that minority is murdering people.
Yeah.
That is how this was set. And so she not only co-sponsored that when she was in the Senate, she has repeatedly advocated for it as vice president. If you go to her campaign website still today, it says, quote, as president, she'll fight to pass the Equality Act. She is looking to strip the church of its religious freedoms in massive ways. This is alarming.
Yeah, and she's not trying to hide it either, which is the crazy part.
Absolutely not.
She's pretty forward about her pattern on if she's elected, what she's going to do, and this is one of those things.
Mm-hmm. And so, you go through her record and what she's done and how she's behaved, and you see, there starts to come a picture where there's this antipathy toward Christians who believe what it is their religion says, right? So as a senator, there was a guy named Brian Boucher who was going to the federal court. He was being nominated as a judge. And so during the confirmation process, she accused him of being an extremist, unfit for the bench, purely because he was a member of something called the Knights of Columbus. And what's the Knights of Columbus?
Yeah, it doesn't sound good.
It's the world's largest Catholic fraternal organization. Okay. More than 2 million people in it. It's not
so not extreme terrorists.
No, it's like their Bible study groups, right? And so she came to him and was like, this is disqualifying. The fact that you're a part of a Catholic Bible study group, a men's group, means you can't have the office. I don't know if she knows this, but Article 6 of the Constitution flat out states, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office.
She does not know that.
Yeah, so she's going after saying, oh, you're a devout Catholic, you're a part of this organization, you're unfit, you're an extremist, that's not good. But then you get in, when she serves as vice president, you just start watching at the amount of censorship that starts coming out of this administration. So here's, during COVID, for example, an executive order requiring every single federal employee to be vaccinated or fired. 8,000 military servicemen and women discharged. They imposed lockdowns and shuttered businesses and closed churches. Remember that? They shut down schools and closed national parks and required social distancings and masks. And beyond that, so that was like, everybody was like, civil libertarians like me were like, whoa, this is a big overreach. Is everybody good with this? Like, we're okay with the government imposing this many restrictions and people just kind of lie down for this? This is dangerous because tyrannies always emerge in the midst of crisis.
Yeah.
That's when they happen. But beyond that, let's look at what else she has done that's antagonistic toward Christian ministries. Ready? So right alongside President Biden during this administration, she targeted sacred beliefs of Christian organizations. Here's a few. The Christian Employers Alliance was forced to sue the Biden-Harris administration because the government sought to force religious employers and healthcare providers to pay for gender transition surgeries, treatments, and counseling.
That's crazy.
Right? So think the Christian Employers Alliance, they have to pay
sue
for gender transition surgeries. Are you kidding? So they sued. And again, a federal judge says, you can't do that, government. That's way over the line to demand of Christians. And the government ended up having to pay $210,000 in attorney's fees, but they had to sue for their religious freedom.
Again, a pattern of Vice
It's
President
a pattern.
Harris.
It's totally a pattern. Here's another one. In Florida, the Catholic Medical Association filed suit against the Biden-Harris administration because the government sought to force Catholic hospitals to provide transition services, puberty blockers, the so-called gender-affirming care to patients. They threatened Catholic hospitals with severe penalties if they refused to acknowledge the patient's perceived gender identity in medical care and use the right pronouns. Kind of wild. Here's one. In Missouri, a university called the College of the Ozarks. This is a private Christian university. They were forced to file a lawsuit against the Biden-Harris administration for forcing them to assign students to bedrooms and shared shower spaces according to their own perceived gender identity. So when a student comes in, imagine sending your daughter off to private Christian university and because you appreciate those ethics. In comes the Biden-Harris administration that says, no, she's got a room with a biological man who's going to shower with her as well. And the Christian university has no right to say no, has to sue for it, still caught up in all the legal stuff. And the administration has threatened the school with six-figure fines, punitive damages, and attorney's fees if they disobey the order. What are you doing? I feel like, are you against me? Because I'm a Christian, I'm an evangelical, I'm a conservative, I'm pro-life, I don't believe in all the transgender nonsense. Is the government after? Are they my enemy? Are they trying to squelch and silence my beliefs? Because it sure feels that way. Move on. U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops had to file a lawsuit against the Biden-Harris administration for requiring them to subsidize employee abortions and contraception, even though that's against Catholic doctrine, in their healthcare plans, against their religious beliefs. And again, a federal court comes along and says the order's you can't do that. It's unconstitutional. The Biden administration is appealing. No, we must force them to do that. Stop. That's a violation of their First Amendment right to not kill babies with their own money. Pretty wild.
Yeah, the huge red flag is that they ever have to sue the government to stop something that the government should have never been involved in at the beginning.
That's right.
Just how many times it has happened. Just in this list, and this is not a fully exhaustive
this
list
is
either.
nowhere
This
near
is
exhaustive.
It's absolutely insane that in the freedom of America that we have to sue to just say, government, you were never supposed to belong here. You should never have said that anyways. Mm-hmm. And then we have to dish it out in court, which is wild.
Yeah. Here's another one. 19 Republican attorneys general joined forces to fight a new law that was coming out of the Department of Health and Human Services. The new rule is called Safe and Appropriate Foster Care Placement Requirements, again, issued by the Biden-Harris administration. And guess what it does? It targets religious beliefs of foster parents and adoption agencies. So the new rule requires, what's the new rule? Well, it requires new foster families to honor the foster child's choice of pronouns, a new name, and a preferred gender identity. You get into the rules, and it says all new prospective parents will be required to undergo training, quote, to be prepared with the appropriate knowledge and skills to provide for the needs of the child related to the child's self-identified sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So how are you to cultivate and shepherd this child? They say, oh, open your Bible and give counsel from the Word. No, you have to set that aside and now go with the state. The state's going to come into your home, tell you how to parent, tell you how to affirm gender identity and sexual orientation and everything else. And then when it goes on, listen to this, the agencies that are in charge of foster parents and adoption processes, they're required to, quote, review requirements for children in foster care who identify as, get ready for it, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning intersex, as well as children who are non-binary or have non-conforming gender identity or expression. What message does that send to evangelicals or Catholics or Muslims, for that matter, that are looking to go in to places where there are foster children eager to be adopted? What message does it send to them?
We don't want you to do it.
We don't want you to do it. Your beliefs are arcane. You're no longer part of it. Unless you're willing to give up your religious convictions, you're no longer part of the game. Oh, by the way, all you agencies that help run this, because how many of the foster care agencies around here do you know that aren't Christian? Not many. You have to set aside your beliefs to conform with the Biden-Harris dogma, or you lose your ability to participate in rescuing children from parentless homes. That makes me angry, actually.
Yeah.
Do you feel targeted? Like, this feels like it's on the nose. It says, hey, parents, because now you see states around the country, California, for instance, that is now going so far to say, if you're a natural parent of a child and they have gender identity disorder and they start saying, I identify as the opposite sex, and you don't affirm them, now the state can come and strip custody from you. We're walking down a road where religious liberties are very, very quickly dying, eroding, being attacked. And unless the church steps up and says, no, I am not going to allow that, and I'm not going to vote for it. I'm going to vote for whoever or whatever it is that keeps the liberties from eroding and decaying away, because I value my role as a parent of my child. I value my role as a pastor, a Christian, a church to the community, and I want to be able to hold what's sacred without the government coming and prying it out of my hands.
And it's not just for Christians. This is going to be eventually anybody the government says, hey, this is the rules. You either play by them or you're out.
That's
which
right.
is terrifying because it could change on a dime.
100%. And you see the systematic targeting. And this is one of the things where it's like, the government is founded with this idea that there's equal justice for all, right? Everybody should feel like I'm equal to this person. We're seeing the same in the eyes of the law. Justice is blind. But you see that that's not the case anymore. Like, I know more people that are on the religious side that are devoutly religious, that feel targeted, that feel ignored in injustices more so now than ever before. And I'll give you an example of this, because this one really bothered me. If you went back to 1994, under President Bill Clinton, Congress passed something called the FACE Act. And what it said was, okay, abortion protesters are getting too close to clinics. They're making it uncomfortable for women that are going to receive an abortion. It feels threatening. So they put provisions that say you're not allowed to do this. You have to stay this far away from the front door and all that stuff. And so since then, there have been more than 200 cases where people have been brought up on charges for violating the FACE Act. And they're intense like the penalties for this, like you can be in prison for more than a decade.
Wow.
90, and that was to apply, by the way, both for abortion clinics and the crisis pregnancy centers. So if there's protesters coming against the pro-life people, that's the only way it passed through Congress. Since then, there's been more than 200 cases where someone's been charged. 97% of those cases were all on the anti-abortion side, right? So they only arrest the pro-lifers. And under Biden-Harris, this is aggressively ramping up. And only in one direction. So I'll give you examples, and these kind of break my heart. But in one case, protesters lined up in a hallway it was in an office building that led to an abortionist's office. There's a video of this, and they're praying and they're singing hymns. They're not protesting, they're not shouting, they're not grabbing, they're not obstructing. They didn't restrain anyone, they didn't assault anyone. They were arrested, and they faced more than a decade in prison for violating the FACE Act. The FBI agents arrested one of them with assault rifles drawn.
Wow.
That's a little much. After the Dobbs decision, just a couple of months after the Dobbs decision, this next one happened, which is egregious to me. But a guy, I think his name's pronounced Mark Houck. He was with his 12-year-old son. They were protesting at an abortion clinic, following all the rules, when one of the clinic's volunteers comes out and gets aggressive with his 12-year-old son. And so, like I would do, or any good dad would do, you come in and say, no, you're not going to get in the face of my 12-year-old, like step back. And so he left there, didn't think much of it, right? That happened in October 2021. September 2022, almost a full year later, but 3 months after the Dobbs decision, guess what happens? The FBI, 24 FBI agents come and they raid the home of this guy with guns drawn as his wife and 7 kids watched and screamed in terror. The charges were so absurd that the prosecutor was forced to drop all the charges. A judge even dismissed the civil lawsuit. It was like, this guy, he did nothing wrong. He defended his 12-year-old boy. Of course, this is everything dismissed. But that begs the question, why does the FBI show up with 24 armed agents, guns drawn in a house with a wife and 7 kids to get this guy? 3 months after the Dobbs decision, what do you think the message is?
That's some intimidation right there.
We're going to intimidate pro-life voices. So I don't know how else to process that as a pro-life guy. I see that and I'm like, that's for sure overkill. Guy doesn't have like the record of a terrorist to where they need to go with an assault team. That's wild. So that's not a good look from this Biden-Harris administration and Department of Justice. It feels a little excessive.
Yeah, not how I want the FBI to be spending their time either.
Absolutely not. And so let's say, okay, we've got all these cases with the FACE Act. Let's look to the other side, right? Because man, they'll arrest people for praying and singing hymns in a hallway. What must they do to people who protest pro-life side, the other side? So the year following the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe versus Wade, there were 85 documented attacks on crisis pregnancy centers. There were 152 attacks on Catholic churches. Some of the centers were firebombed. Others were covered with graffiti. They had it scrawled all over it and graffiti. If abortions aren't safe, neither are you.
Wow.
So this extremist group, Jane's Revenge, takes credit for the attacks, and they write, I'm quoting from them, "We have demonstrated in the past month how easy and fun it is to attack." And then they promise to take, quote, "increasingly drastic measures against oppressive infrastructures. Rest assured that we will, and those measures may not come in the form of something so easily cleaned up as fire and graffiti. It's open season, and we know where your operations are."
No one got arrested from that statement?
Small handful. Oh, this? No. So several entities came forward to the DOJ and said, here, look at this burned building, look at this graffiti, look at this online post, and they say this group needs to be listed as a domestic terrorist organization. What do you think the FBI and the DOJ did?
They refused.
They refused. What? Oh, and by the way, did you see recently, this is just from the last couple of weeks, where Fort Liberty used to be Fort Bragg, where the Army was caught on video and pictures teaching soldiers that the national right to life. I used to be a member of that. I used to be on the board of Broward Right to Life. They were a terrorist organization. They taught this for 10 years at Fort Bragg and Fort Liberty, that pro-lifers, people with pro-life plates, that the organization, the National Right to Life, is a terrorist organization. Meanwhile, the DOJ refuses to list Jane's Revenge as a terrorist organization. So again, if you're me, do you feel like the DOJ's on your side? Do you feel like there's equal justice under the law? Do you feel like the administration currently is applying equal standards to everybody and honoring religious liberties and deeply held sacred beliefs?
Not yet.
I don't. I don't at all. I feel very uncomfortable with where the nation's going, quite frankly. And so, of course, that's now a common thing among conservatives and conservative evangelicals and people that have devout religious faith. It's like, wow, I feel like we're on the outsiders. And meanwhile, when the nation's awaiting the Dobbs decision, what happens? You have protesters that are going to all of the conservative Supreme Court justices' houses. They're lining up, they're screaming, they're doing crazy things with the neighborhood. What does the DOJ do? They say, oh my gosh, these are Supreme Court justices. They need extra security. Well, no, Not until a guy's going through Justice Kavanaugh's neighborhood with a gun, a knife, pepper spray, and burglary tools. Then they're like, oh yeah, maybe we should do something. But it's like one side gets all the protection. We're going to charge you for more than a decade. And the other side, it's fire bombings and graffiti, and it's a tiny handful. And we don't even consider that a terrorist organization.
Wow.
That's problematic for me, right? And so beyond that, like, it's not just unequal application of justice under this administration, but you see increased censorship to silence people that have my beliefs and your beliefs. And this is also a problem. So the aversion to First Amendment rights of American citizens is increasing. And it's increasing from more and more one side of the aisle. And people on that side that are classical liberals are calling it out. You'll hear Bill Maher talk about it. You'll hear classic liberals say, whoa, we're becoming the party of censorship. Let's stop, right? So former Democratic president candidate John Kerry, who's a member of the Biden-Harris regime as their climate guy, recently gave an interview in which he said, listen to what he said.
Our First Amendment stands as a major block to the ability to be able to just, hammer it out of existence. So
hammer it, meaning disinformation, out of existence.
That's terrifying.
Like, this First Amendment. Listening to people who disagree with us, it's just really getting in the way of our right to govern. Here's another one. Former Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton urged Europe to pass the Digital Services Act, saying for far too long, tech platforms have amplified disinformation. That's going to be a word you hear more and more. And extremism with no accountability. So guess what? They passed it, and now the EU has begun proceedings targeting X and TikTok for allowing unfettered speech. So does she want speech monitors in America? Does she want someone to go through and say, okay, this is acceptable to me or whoever. This is not. This is true. This is not. And speaking, about those platforms, when Elon Musk bought X and started allowing free speech on X, Labor Secretary Robert Reich, famous Democrat, said regulators around the world should threaten Musk with arrest.
It's insane.
What? Like, no. Have you read the First Amendment? Kamala Harris also makes these sorts of statements. She went to a speech that she gave to the NAACP.
We will hold social media platforms accountable.
How, I wonder?
If you act as a megaphone for misinformation or cyber warfare, if you don't police your platforms, we are going to hold you accountable as a community.
In October 2019, a full year before the 2020 election, Senator Harris wrote an open letter to Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey demanding that he suspend President Trump's Twitter account. So think about that. A sitting member of Congress writing to a private company demanding that they censor the speech of a sitting U.S. president. Wow. Whoa. She crusaded for this. In a CNN interview with Jake Tapper, she said this.
He has lost his privileges and it should be taken down. And the bottom line is that you can't say that you have one rule for Facebook and you have a different rule for Twitter. The same rule has to apply, which is that there has to be a responsibility that is placed on these social media sites to understand their power. They are directly speaking to millions and millions of people without any level of oversight or regulation. And that has to stop.
Let me just summarize what she's saying there. These platforms need the government to come in and regulate what people are allowed to say. Just free-fettered right to speech has to stop. Whoa. No.
Yeah.
Are you listening to yourself? Like, go back and read the Constitution and see if that jives with the Constitution. Vice President candidate Tim Walz says this.
There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
So it's misinformation and hate speech. Every time that you hear them try to censor, it's going to be one of those two things.
And it's the vague, what is it?
Yeah, who gets to define that?
Yeah.
So let's just keep going, because this is really a fire hose episode. There's just so much. So in a letter to the House Judiciary Committee, Facebook's founder, who's now the head of, what is it?
Meta,
thank you. Mark Zuckerberg said this, quote, senior officials from the Biden administration, including the White House, repeatedly pressured our teams for months to censor certain COVID-19 content, including humor and satire. I believe the government pressure was wrong, and I regret that we were not more outspoken about it. I feel strongly that we should not compromise our content standards due to pressure from any administration in either direction, and we're ready to push back if something like this ever happens again. I hope that's true.
Positive.
Right? So, but here's evidence is now showing, and we're going to get into this a lot more in a minute, but evidence now shows that the Biden-Harris administration pressured social media companies to censor political opponents to gain advantages in the election. So, in that same interview, Mark Zuckerberg tells Congress that the FBI influenced the company to bury the Hunter Biden laptop story, assuring them that it was Russian disinformation, right? Like they came to him and said, do not allow people to post on that. Regular Americans that are trying to post on this, silence them, remove their posts. And he wrote to them in his letter, it's since been made clear that the reporting was not Russian disinformation. And in retrospect, we shouldn't have demoted the story. But why did they? Because the government used their authority and power to go to a private company to say, stop Americans from being able to speak. And by the way, to speak truth. That's troubling to me. As a libertarian, as a Christian, that's very troubling to me. And so now we're getting into a fire hose. In May of this year, 2024, the House Judiciary Committee released a report. You heard of this? Pretty wild. So the name of the report is The Censorship Industrial Complex, How the Biden White House Officials Coerced Big Tech to Censor Americans, True Information, and the Critics of the Biden Administration. So
nice title.
It's a long one, yeah. But it's pretty spot on. And so what they said is, there's so much evidence now that we have all the emails from these different companies and we have, we've gone and subpoenaed and done these investigations. There was massive censorship where the government used its authority to force private companies to censor American speech, particularly conservative Americans. So Congress scoured all the data from these companies, the so-called Twitter files, which you probably heard about, and the findings were startling. So here we go. This is going to be rapid fire. Sir Nick Clegg, Meta's president of global affairs, wrote an email about how the Biden-Harris administration was pressuring them to silence Americans. Quote, just got off an hour-long call with senior advisor to President Biden, Andy Slavitt. He was outraged, not too strong of a word to describe his reaction, that we did not remove the post. So here you have a Biden administration official who reaches out to Meta and just blasts them saying, I demand that you take down this post. Gives them an hour riot act. And he's like, whoa, I just got chewed out. Here's another one. By the way, that post was warning about the dangers of the COVID vaccine. In July 2021, President Biden publicly accused Facebook of killing people by not censoring the viewpoints of Americans. On the third day of his administration, the Biden-Harris White House demanded that Twitter remove posts that were later deemed factual by Robert Kennedy Jr. Then the administration demanded that they, quote, keep an eye out for tweets that fall in the same genre. The Biden-Harris administration applied pressure on Amazon to change its bookstore content moderation policy. So we like this book. We don't like this book. We need to write the rules that are going to favor our side of the political aisle. And listen to what the internal records of Amazon said. Quote, the impetus for this request is criticism from the Biden administration about sensitive books that we are giving prominent placement to. And these are the same people that talk about banning books that are going to Amazon saying, don't let these, put them down, put them down. We want to raise these books. They help us. So they're forcing private companies, pressuring private companies to influence what speech Americans can hear. Another official at Amazon said that all this was due to criticism from the Biden people. When asked why Facebook had aggressively censored any American citizens who suggested that COVID was man-made in a Wuhan lab, one official said, because we were under pressure from the administration. It's just again and again. When YouTube rewrote their policies to target and censor more content warning about the COVID vaccine, they actually went to the White House, which means the White House is already looking over their shoulder. So they go to the White House saying, what do you think of this? And the White House says, at first blush, this seems like a great step. You're properly censoring people. Good job.
Crazy.
In 2021, the YouTube staff was in communication with the White House expressing a desire to, quote, work closely with the administration on multiple policy fronts. Do you see a problem with that?
Yeah.
I mean, that's like newspaper organizations, YouTube, whatever, going to the White House being like, what would you like us to say? Help us with our, multiple policy fronts. And another set of emails, this one is crazy to me. A Facebook employee wrote, quote, "The Surgeon General wants us to remove true information about side effects."
That seems illegal. That one for sure.
True information. We don't want them to panic and not take the vaccine. Take that down. Take that down. That's crazy.
It's insane.
That is really, really troublesome. So here we go. Here's in the congressional report, they say this, quote, "By September 2021, Facebook, YouTube, and Amazon had each adopted new content moderation policies that removed or reduced viewpoints and content disfavored by the Biden White House." Now, this doesn't look good for us. Take that down. Take that down. Put it down. Eliminate it or give it, change the algorithm to where it's unfindable. It's like you go nowadays, look for abortion news or look for some conservative viewpoint on YouTube, and it's like, man, everything is their perspective. Why do you think that is? That's not an accident. So this extended beyond COVID, beyond the 2020 election. The report says on July 14th, 2022, YouTube government affairs staff contacted the White House personnel offering to brief them. So they're going to the White House saying, "Oh, here's what we're doing. Is this okay?"
Yeah, they're getting ahead of the game.
Gosh, on updates related to addressing reproductive health misinformation on YouTube, to which the White House staff responded saying that they were specially interested in abortion.
Of course.
So anyway, they came back and said, "Hey, yeah. Let's help you get out all this information on abortion. Pro-life stuff gets buried, pro-abortion stuff goes front." And so the White House helped them define what is misinformation with regard to abortion. Guess what they define misinformation as? Pretty much anything you or I would ever say.
Whatever they
right?
want.
Whatever is the pro-life side, that's going to be misinformation. And so it's all one-sided now. A Facebook official complained that the White House intrusion seemed like, quote, "a political battle not fully grounded in facts, and it's frustrating."
Frustrating.
It's very frustrating for me.
What a minor word to use there.
Gosh. And so we get back to okay, it's either hate speech, we got to take that down because it's hate speech, or it's misinformation. So I want to stop for a moment and let's think about how ironic it is that we have a government that's telling us that they should be the ones in charge of misinformation. This is the same government that repeatedly assured us that the vaccine would be 95% effective at preventing COVID. Wrong.
Wrong.
Side effects were nothing to worry about. Wrong. A cloth mask was effective to protect us from COVID. Social distancing works. The Afghanistan situation was stable right up until the collapse. Trump colluded with Russia to steal the 2016 election. Wrong. Disproven. 51 FBI and CIA and government officials trotted out to assure us that the Hunter Biden laptop was a tool of Russian disinformation.
Wrong.
Our southern border has been totally secure. Joe Biden's cognitive faculties, they're not fading. There's no evidence of a Wuhan lab leak. Trump called neo-Nazis very fine people. Trump threatened a violent bloodbath if he lost the election. Everything that our government has been saying, we got to take that down because that's misinformation. They were wrong about so much of it. Our government is losing all credibility. They're the last ones worthy to be guardians of the truth. And yet here you have one side saying we need to stifle speech because there's too much misinformation. You just want to scream, you're the misinformation.
Yeah, you guys are the problem.
You stop talking. Anyway, then the other side is who gets to determine what hate speech is? Because there's a lot of times where I don't feel comfortable with the language that's coming out about my side. Mm-hmm. But you know what? I would fight to the death for their right to say it because I believe they have the right to say it. I believe in the First Amendment. I'm a free speech absolutist besides the fire stuff and all that. But what happens, and we don't recognize what happens when cultures and countries say, we're going to start adopting hate speech laws. What happens? Christians get silenced all over the West. And we don't hear these things, but they happen way more frequently than we want to be comfortable with. So I'm just going to go through some headlines. You ready? A British pastor was arrested by London police for preaching that marriage is a sacred union between a man and a woman. A German pastor was jailed and fined for referring to a Berlin Pride March as demonic and satanic. A Swedish pastor was arrested for preaching against homosexuality. A Finnish member of parliament was put on trial for referring to homosexuality as a sin. An Irish street preacher was arrested for preaching about homosexuality. A Scottish evangelist was arrested for denouncing homosexuality. A Scottish preacher was jailed for quoting scripture to a gay teen. A Canadian street preacher was jailed for sharing the gospel at a pride rally. 2 Australian pastors were jailed after hosting a seminar on Islam that the police feared might vilify Muslims. A Spanish priest faces 3 years in jail for criticizing Islam. These hate speech laws that have taken root in Europe are resulting in the demolition of Christian liberties and the ability to say even uncomfortable parts of the Bible. And here's something that's kind of crazy. Thankfully, none of these convictions happened, but a Seattle pastor was arrested for reading the Bible at a pride event. A Pennsylvania preacher was arrested for reading the Bible at a pride event. A Wisconsin street preacher was arrested for reading the book of Galatians on the sidewalk at a Pride in the Park event. An Arkansas street preacher was arrested at a pride event. And you know what all of them have? Like, this is hateful.
Yeah.
This is hateful to read the scriptures, to give a biblical message that might make others uncomfortable. That's hateful. We need to stop it. Okay, well, what's going to ultimately happen? Then the government's going to come and say, okay, you're allowed to preach from this part of the Bible, but not that part of the Bible. That sounds like China, where they say, okay, this is condoned. You're allowed to say this. You're not allowed to say this. And by the way, every time you ever see tyranny take over a culture, look at the last century. You know what one of the first things they always do is?
Get rid of free speech.
Get rid of free speech and crush the church. Because the church comes and says, no, we have a king that's above you. We have absolutes that exceed what the tyrant tells us. We have a liberty that can't be squashed. And so the church stands against tyranny, and they're always the first to get smashed. And so we should be really mindful of all the dangerously polarized climate we now live in, because now there's retribution against political adversaries. I remember seeing this in 2022. It was a Rasmussen poll, and it was of that particular political party, the Democratic Party, and they surveyed and they said, do you support this? And 78% supported mandatory COVID vaccination for government and private companies. 55% wanted to fine Americans who refused the vaccine. 59% believe the non-vaccinated should be confined to their homes at all times. 45% wanted the non-vaccinated to live in designated facilities. What does that sound like? 48% thought the government should fine or imprison individuals who publicly question the efficacy of the existing COVID-19 vaccines on social media. 47% wanted the government to require a wearable device that tracks unvaccinated people. And 29% believe that the government should temporarily remove parents' custody of their children. There's such a large number of Americans who have no idea of the beauty of the way that our government is set up, the value of liberty. And now you consider some of the headlines that you see in major papers lately, like The New Yorker, is it time to torch the Constitution? My goodness. The New York Times, the Constitution is sacred. Is it also dangerous? New York Times, the Constitution is broken and should not be reclaimed. The New York Times, the First Amendment's out of control. The Hoover Institution says our outdated Constitution. Here we have Newsweek with an article, The Case Against the Constitution. Or the Washington Post, what America really needs is to abolish Congress. Or the New York Times again, let's give up on the Constitution. Like when you start talking to me about my fears of a threat to democracy, Trump doesn't scare me.
No.
This scares me. It's revolutionary. It really, truly is.
Okay, so that list was very long,
Yes, it was.
but it's important to say all of that and to show all of that because, again, we're trying to put two people up against each other. Two candidates that we have. One has that laundry list of things that she has done, she has supported, trying to take away liberties at all costs. And then we go back to the beginning of this episode where the other candidate says, okay, he says some inflammatory things for sure. He says some things that are rude for sure. And one time he placed a 90-day temporary ban on 7 Muslim nations coming into this country. And when you put the scales of that, one is clearly better.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And so you can get caught in, seeing all of this for what it is, which, I think is a threat to liberty. But at the end of the day, like where I want us to think is because this is how should Christians vote, right? I think a civil libertarian would look at this and be alarmed, even if they weren't a believer. But as a believer, like, what is our greatest hope? Our greatest hope is to, we're called to bring the flavor of heaven down into this earth, to bring righteousness down into this earth, and to have a government that now seems, animosity to force us to comply with the world's way of doing things. It feels like it would require a retreat of heavenly ethics, a retreat of righteousness. And if they begin and continue or expand the efforts to censor speech, speech is the means by which we preach the gospel, by which we confront sin, by which we do what we need to do to bring others into the citizenship of heaven. And so from purely a perspective of how Christians should vote, if we want to bring righteousness and we want Christian foster parents and adoption agencies, and we want to bring the flavor of heaven to this earth, what I'm saying is the proof is in the pudding of the last 3.5 years or 4 years that there's an active series of attacks that are coming against our efforts to do that, that there's increasing censorship to speech that doesn't align with their political ideology. And for me, like, there's a heavenly agenda to this that goes beyond just the two political candidates, because the two political candidates are not what's going to rescue us. At the end of the day, no. We talked about voting between the lesser of two evils, and at this point, it's like voting for the one that's going to allow evil to advance less, and that's a righteous cause. Preserving liberty, preserving speech, preserving religious liberty, preserving these platforms, the media, social media companies, to be able to allow Americans to say what they think, even if it's wrong. You're allowed to be wrong. Even if it's unpopular, even if it might hurt my feelings, you're allowed to speak. That is sacred. That makes us better as a nation when we can speak unvarnished. But when you have this culture of fear that starts saying, am I allowed to say that? Am I allowed to do that? Am I allowed? You begin dwindling into tyranny to where the nation will start seeing it and being like, oh, this is normalized. You become the frog in the pot when the water's boiling, and before you know it, all your freedoms are gone, and you think, how did we get here? It's because you started making small compromises with candidates that are telling you what they're going to do. They've shown you what they're going to do. Don't give in to that. Demand better.
So get out there and vote.
Amen. I want to thank you for watching this episode of In God We Trusted on how Christians should vote. I also want to tell you that this program is actually sponsored by Sunlit Studios, and we have multiple channels that we want to encourage you to check out. So we have Under the Hood, which is a show about the Bible and archaeology and different historical things and bringing the Bible to life in that context. We have another channel called The Bible Show, which goes to specific passages of the Bible and kind of goes deep. It gets into the meat of the scriptures and pulls out devotional elements. We want to encourage you to check out those channels as well, and join us next time as we go into another series on In God We Trusted.